Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be doing part 2 of my winter wrap-up. So, things have been pretty crazy in my life lately. As you all know, there is a certain virus going around, and my campus has actually closed campus and will be doing classes online for the remainder of the semester. So you'll probably see this background a lot more often than my old background. I don't know yet, I may move out. I'm not sure. I'm gonna do a whole life update video about that, so stay tuned for that. But basically, this is going to be a new background for a while, and this background is by no means complete. I have a lot of things that are still at my dorm that I want to have on the shelf, but I don't have with me. And a lot of my books are actually missing from this shelf because they're at my dorm. So just keep that in mind when you're seeing this background, and this is definitely a work in progress. I don't know how I want to set it up yet, or how it's all gonna go. But basically, this is part 2 of a 2-part video because I read so many books in winter that I had to split it up because there was way too many to talk about in one video. So I did part 1 last week, so make sure you go check that out, and I will link it up above for you. But so this is part 2. So this will be covering all of the books that I read from the beginning of 2020 up until today. Also, I just want to let you guys know that I have been doing a highlight story on my Instagram of all of the books that I've been finishing this year. So every time I finish a book, I post a little picture that has the book on it and the number of books that I had read this year, out of my goal for the year, and then the date I started it, the day I finished it, and then my rating for it, of course. So if you want to check that out, if you go to my Bookstagram, which I of course link my Bookstagram in every video down below, there will be a highlights that just says 2020 reads, and so you can click through and see all of the books that I've read so far and the order that I read them in, because this video is going to kind of take them out of order just because I've read a lot of series, but I didn't read this series back to back to back. I'm going to talk about all of this series at the same time in this video, if that makes sense. Anyway, let's just get into it because we have a lot of books to cover today. So first I listened to the audiobook for The Babysitters Coven by Kate Williams. This is about a group of girls who have a babysitting club. This new girl comes to town and she unlocks some secrets about superpowers and magical rituals and saving the innocent and all of that kind of thing in this book. I really enjoyed the whimsicality, is that a word? Whimsicalness? I'm not sure. Of this book. It is a fantasy, which I don't typically enjoy, but it's a low fantasy. It was just really easy to get into. There wasn't a lot of world building, which I don't typically like. I also thought the magic system was really interesting in the way that they cast spells and the way that they do their magic was an interesting take. I really enjoyed this one, and I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read Layer of Dreams by Libba Bray. This is the second book in the much-loved Diviners series. I'm sure you've probably heard lots about these books on BookTube because the finale just came out recently. The Diviners is about, it's a paranormal historical fiction. It takes place in the 1920s New York. It follows the character Evie, who moves in with her uncle, and her uncle is actually asked to help solve these murder cases. This book combines magic and murder mystery along with the historical setting of the 1920s era. And there are many well-developed characters in the book. I really enjoyed the first book, The Diviners, but this book, Layer of Dreams, I didn't enjoy it quite as much, unfortunately. The first book mostly followed Evie and had some other chapters of characters sprinkled throughout the story, but the second book had a lot more of the other characters and less of Evie, and that's just a personal thing for me. I don't really like having so many characters and being in so many characters' heads. I like having 1 or maybe 2 or 3 just to keep me grounded in what's happening, because once you get with a bunch of characters in this book, I kind of start to get confused, which is what happened here. I still thought it was a decent book overall, and I gave it 3.5 stars, and I do plan on reading the sequels. Next, I read the final book in the Vampire Academy series, which is Last Sacrifice by Rochelle Mead. I did my whole Vampire Academy spiel in the last video, so if you want to hear more about this series, you should just click the link, go check out the first video. Of course, as you all know, I love this series, and I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. After that, I read Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. This is the first book in the Grisha trilogy, which, if you didn't know, is the prequel to the Six of Crows series. I buddy read this with a friend from Instagram, and I will link her information down below if you want to check her out as well. She's super fun, and her Instagram pictures are amazing. But this is a fantasy series that follows the main character, Lena, who finds out that she has Grisha powers. And then she's whisked away to the royal court, and she has to be trained to be a Grisha. But there's a darkness over their land called the Fold, and things unfold. I'm not funny. Throughout the story, just based on the conflicts that were developed. I really enjoyed the first book, even though it was a high fantasy, which can be hard for me to get into at times. And I thought this book was just really well done with world building, even though I hate world building. And the characters were well developed. There were definitely some interesting plot twists that happened. I gave this one 4 stars. Next, I read Evermore by Alison Noel. I actually read the first 5 books in this series that I will be talking about in this video. I'm currently reading the 6th one, so in my next wrap up I'll cover that one. So I'm just gonna talk about the first book, but know that I have read 5 books in this series. And we'll get to that. This book follows a girl named Ever, whose family recently died in a car crash, leaving her orphaned. Then she has to move in with her aunt and go to a whole new school with no friends and has no idea what's happening. And she has these new developed powers since the accident, which make things even more difficult for her being a teenager in a new high school. But then she meets a boy named Damon, and he's also mysterious. He kind of provides more questions than answers to what's happening in Ever's life. So like I said, I have read the first 5 books, and I'm currently reading the final book in the series. I thought the first 2 books were pretty good, but the rest of the series kind of fell flat to me, at least so far. There have been conflicts that have come up that just feel forced and don't feel like they were needed or that they make sense in the plot line. There was this one conflict that came up in book 2, and it's still not resolved fully, but they kind of came up with a solution, but it's a band-aid solution, it's not a full solution to the problem, and it just makes things worse. It bothers me that they have not really addressed that problem specifically, and they're just moving on with their lives, even though it still is a problem that they're facing. Anyway, that bothers me. So I'm just gonna rapid fire all of my ratings really quick. So I gave the first book, Evermore, 3 stars. The second book, Blue Moon, 4 stars. The third book, Shadowland, 3 stars. The fourth book, Dark Flame, 2.5 stars. And the fifth book, Night Star, 3 stars. So honestly, I probably should have just stopped reading the series based on the ratings that I've been giving the books so far. But I had started reading the series when I was in middle school, and I never finished it, and I'm mad about it. So I want to finish the series this time. So I'm kind of just sticking it out because I want to finish it. And I don't know why. It just it will make me feel good, I guess. Next, I listened to the audiobook for Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. This is a fantasy book that follows the story of Simon Snow, who's a chosen one, but he's a very bad chosen one. This book is basically a satire on the chosen one trope, and it very much resembles Harry Potter, on purpose, of course. Because he's a wizard, and there's a magical school, and there's an omnipotent villain. I have read this book before, and the first time I got a little confused towards the end of the book, and so I gave it a 3-star rating the first time, but I wanted to read the sequel, Wayward Son, which just recently came out, so I wanted to reread Carry On to make sure I understood better what happened in that book, because I didn't really get it the first time. But the second time around, I did understand more, and I gave it 4 stars that time. Then I read Frankly in Love by David Yoon. This is about a Korean boy who is stuck between his parents' expectations and his social life. His parents want him to date a Korean girl, but then he falls in love with a white girl, and so he decides to fake date a Korean girl to please his parents. I found this book very info-dumpy, which is weird because it's a contemporary. There was just lots of narration that was just telling us stuff that I felt wasn't necessary, and it was kind of just shoved at you instead of unfolding naturally the way normal books do, which I found to be tedious at times. So I just really didn't click with the writing style of this book, and honestly most of the plot has left my mind because I didn't like it. I thought the romance was pretty boring and that both the female characters felt very similar to each other. But what I did like about this book was the Korean representation that it provided, and I gave this book 2 stars. Next, I read the sequel to Carry On, which is Wayward Son, like I mentioned before. I'm not going to talk much about what happens just because I already explained what happens in Carry On. Like I said, I thought Carry On was pretty enjoyable, but I actually enjoyed Wayward Son a little bit better, and that's because I feel like Wayward Son feels more like a contemporary than a fantasy. Like, Carry On was very much like, it was low fantasy, but it was like on that edge between low fantasy and high fantasy. And Wayward Son just doesn't feel like that. It follows like the aftermath of what happened in the first book and follows mostly about the characters and their relationships with other characters. Carry On was plot driven, and this book, Wayward Son, felt more character driven, which I prefer over plot driven books, which is why I think I enjoyed it more. There were still some fantastical elements in this book, of course, but I really enjoyed this book, and so I also gave this one 4 stars. Next, I read The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This is an adult magical realism-ish fantasy. I'm not quite sure what genre to put it in. It feels like magical realism, I think, but it could be on the edge of a fantasy. It's about a traveling circus that only opens at night, but the circus kind of serves as like a place for this sort of like game/battle thing between 2 magicians. The magicians like don't really know what's going on. They just know that they have to do this battle/game thing. There's a lot more to this book than what I just told you and what appears on the surface. It's a very deep book that like there's lots of like layers of plot and characters that kind of like coincide, and they all like snake together. The story is just kind of hard to explain. You kind of just have to jump in not knowing much and just figure it all out for yourself. I really liked this book, and I thought it was very whimsical and magical and fun, so I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. This is an adult romance novel about 2 characters, Josh and Hazel, who have known each other since college, but when the book takes place 10 years later, they finally actually like get to know each other. Like, they knew each other at first, but like now they've actually like spent time with each other and like actually deeply understand each other. And the book kind of starts off with Josh, who just finds out his girlfriend has been cheating on him, and so he spends a lot of time with Hazel, and the 2 of them actually set up double blind dates for each other. So Hazel will find a guy that Wait, no, that's wrong. Hazel will find a girl that she knows and set her up with Josh, and Josh will find a guy that he knows and set him up with Hazel, and they would go on this double date together, and they all end like terribly, like nothing goes right. But Josh and Hazel have just been having fun this whole time while they're doing these double blind dates. But of course, how long can they pretend that they don't have feelings for each other? So this is a very cute, fluffy romance that I really enjoyed. I ended up giving it 5 stars. It's a really amazing story that has still stuck with me. Next, I read Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo. This is the sequel to Shadow and Bone, which I already covered, so I won't probably talk as much about Siege and Storm. As I said earlier, I enjoyed the first book, but I didn't really enjoy this one quite as much. The plot kind of moved a lot slower than the first book did, and the characters were developed in a way that I wasn't expecting and I don't necessarily agree with, and some things happened that I just was like, okay, I guess this is happening now. Overall, it was still a good book, and I gave it 3 stars. And on to the next book, which was Playlist for the Dead by Michelle Falkoff. I originally started buddy reading this with my friend Lexi during our 24-hour readathon, which I'll link above, but we ended up only reading a couple chapters, and so I took the book with me and I kept reading it until I finished. And honestly, it took me a while to finish because I was kind of getting bored with it. So this book follows the story of Sam, who finds his best friend dead, who he had committed suicide, and the only thing that his best friend left behind was a playlist of music. And now Sam is trying to figure out why his best friend killed himself, and he has the music to kind of help him out. This kind of reminds me of like 13 Reasons Why, in the fact that there's like a playlist left behind. You know, like in 13 Reasons Why, there's like the tapes left behind after the suicide. So like there's kind of those vibes, but other than that, there's really no similarities. Honestly, I thought this book went pretty slow. There really wasn't much dialogue, and there was a lot of really dense descriptions and a lot of the main character just thinking to himself and sitting with himself in his room just thinking about the suicide. And like, I thought that was kind of boring to read about. There were some more interesting things that happened as the story progressed, like towards the end of the book, which were pretty good, but like overall it wasn't super amazing or anything. And I gave this book 2.5 stars. The next book I read was Every Day by David Levithan. I listened to this on audiobook. because I wanted to reread it. I had read it when I was in like 7th or 8th grade, and I really enjoyed it then, but I found out recently that there are sequels, so I wanted to reread it so I could read the sequels. And I actually did purchase one of the sequels recently, which I will haul in an upcoming video whenever I have enough books to do a haul. But I wanted to reread it so I could read the sequels. So this follows a character named A who wakes up in a different body every day. He or she, there really is no like gender placed on the character. They don't have their own body, so they wake up every day in someone else's body, and it's only for a day. And A is kind of just settled with this. He knows that this is his life, and there's nothing he can really do about it. Until one day he meets a girl named Rhiannon, and he falls in love with her, and now he has to try to kind of explain to her his situation and try to get her to still love him, even though he is in a kind of crazy predicament. I loved this book the first time I read it, and it did not disappoint the second time. It was very well done. It's a very interesting idea. I am sure that the other books in the series will also be just as good. And I gave this one 4.5 stars. Next, I read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This is a classic, and if you haven't been on here for a while, you wouldn't know that I don't really like classics that much. They just don't suit me. I think that they're boring and not fun, not relatable. And this one was no exception. It takes place in like 1800s England, I think. But I had to read this book for my literature class, so it got read. It follows this guy named Dorian who has this other guy, Basil, who's a painter, paint a portrait of Dorian. And this portrait is like the most beautiful thing that anybody has seen. And Dorian like sees it and he's like, oh, I wish that I could be young and beautiful forever. And I will age and this portrait will not. And he's like, I would do anything to stay young and beautiful. And so his wish like kind of comes true because as Dorian ages, he doesn't like age. He doesn't look older. His portrait kind of takes on the aging for him. And Dorian kind of gets driven mad by realizing that the portrait is changing and he is not. And so all of the cruelty that Dorian does also is represented in the portrait. Now, I know it sounds like a pretty interesting premise, and overall the plot I thought was decent, but I do not like the writing. It was very dense. You know, like old-timey type writing? That's what it felt like. It was hard to read. It was hard to understand at times. The only reason I really know what's going on in this book is because we had discussions in my class about it, and I like spark notes it when I didn't know what was happening. Overall, it just wasn't my favorite, and I didn't really like it that much at all, and I give it 1 star. Next, I read the Visions Trilogy by Lisa McMann. I decided to read this because Lisa McMann is the author of one of my all-time favorite series, the Wake Trilogy, which I've talked about a lot on this channel. The first book, Crash, follows the story of this girl named Jules who works at her family-owned pizza shop. One day, she just starts seeing these visions of this truck just hurtling into a building and exploding and inevitably killing everybody in there. And so she does everything in her power to try to keep this vision from coming true. And so each book in the trilogy follows a different vision and them just trying to keep the vision from happening because they're all really bad things and that are going to kill a lot of people. Lisa McMann's writing is so straightforward and just easy to understand, and it really gets to the point, and I follow it very well, and actually it allows me to just speed through books really fast. I listened to all 3 of the books on audio, but I guarantee you if I was reading them, I could have finished them in probably about the same time as I finished them in audio because they're just so easy to read. I really enjoyed these books and I gave them all Crash, Bang, and Gasp 4.5 out of 5 stars. And finally, I read The House of Scorpion by Nancy Farmer. I read this for a book club that I am now in, which may not be happening anymore considering of what's happening in the world right now. But this was our book of the month for the book club. And this book follows the story of Mateo, who's actually the clone of a drug lord named El Patron. And this sounds like a really interesting premise, and at first I was really into the book, but as the book went on, I just slowly lost interest. And I probably couldn't tell you what happened at the end of it because I didn't care. I just wasn't paying attention at that point. I only read it because I was in the book club. I didn't like this book and I gave it 2.5 stars. And that is all for the winter wrap-up. Whew, that was a lot of books to get through. And I'm so grateful if you stuck through it all and you made it to the end of this video. Remember to check out part 1 if you haven't looked at it already. I did mention this in part 1, but I'm going to bring it up again. I'm probably going to be doing monthly wrap-ups from now on, just because this was a lot of books to cover, and I never want to have to do this again. And I think I can do monthly wrap-ups. I think I can get through enough books per month to be able to do that. I will still do seasonal TBRs, just because I like having a couple of books that I want to get to, but not, like, restraining myself in any way. Of course, I never really get to all the books on my TBR anyway, but that's besides the point. So stay tuned, because I'll probably have my spring TBR coming up soon. But thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please make sure to give it a like, and also consider subscribing if you aren't already, and hit the bell icon so you get notified whenever I post a new video. I post new videos on Fridays at 5 p.m. Central Time. If you want to follow me on social media, all my links are in the description box down below as always. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and that's all for me today, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!